So, welcome everyone to Sangha Night, and this is second in a series of trying to give you a sense of what we might be exploring in Buddhist ritual. So last week I was aware of, probably talking to a few of you that maybe have some complex relationship with ritual. And this week, hopefully, it'll be a more straightforward presentation of, I'm describing it of the enacting of the path. This is really what we do in ritual. We're enacting a path. So as a way of going into that, I thought I'd like to start this evening by just looking at how we live out of the stories that we weave for ourselves. So this is a Buddhist perspective that our mind, I mentioned this last week, I think that out of our mind, the world that we perceive comes into being. So we live out of the stories that we weave. And in our mind, we create the stories about who we are and how the world is and what's important to us, what we're longing for. And these are all patterns. And part of being human is that we are pattern makers. We are meaning makers. And each one of us is creating these patterns, these meanings, and wrapping them around ourselves, this woven cloth of story around our unique being that helps us to create a sense of selfhood. So every one of us is living out of a story that we've created for ourselves or we've bought into in some way. And we might not even be aware that we are living out these stories, that they are driving our lives. But they will be there if we look. And in the context of this community here, the Sangha, this community of practitioners engaging with the Dharma, we might imagine that we are all living from just one common story, one shape that we are participating in. However, just by fortuitous chance this week, a few of the order from Bristol, we've actually been on a teaching retreat looking at the different myths that may be driving our spiritual life. So there are 4 myths that we will be probably participating in some degree. So I thought I'd start this evening just to illustrate this sense that we are living out of stories and how we can make that more conscious by actually having a look at what's referred to as the 4 myths or the 4 stories. Other words for it could be the 4 paradigms, maybe, might be a more helpful term. However we describe it, it's these stories that are framing our practice, framing our path. So let's have just spend a bit of time just having a look at those to start with before we go into so I'm hoping you can see that. And let me just, okay. So I'm hoping everybody can see that. I've shared an image on the screen. So this is really, I think hopefully this is helpful for us all, whether or not we're involved in a ritual course or just, but simply more generally for our practice, it might be helpful for us to recognize where we are on this grid of different ways of approaching the spiritual life, these different stories that we in some ways buy into. So you can see from this diagram that we have two basic poles to experience, two basic biases to our experience. We can say we either are more drawn to the active end of practice or to the more receptive end, and that will affect the different ways that we practice. So looking on the screen here, I'm just going to run through very quickly these four areas here. These are the four myths: the myth of development, the myth of surrender, the myth of discovery, and the myth of emergence. So the first myth, myth of development. So this is seeing a very active involvement in the practice. And it's the whole idea of growth and development. If I practice in a particular way, I will become the Buddha through following the disciplines, the teachings of the Dharma. So this methodology, this story that we engage in, it believes that we need to change in some way to become the ideal. If we're going to move towards liberation, we have to change, transform our current sense of being. And this myth can be really helpful for us because it can give us a real sense of growth and momentum as we move into a whole new way of being in our lives. It suggests that we can move towards wisdom and compassion through our own efforts to transform our own deluded, flawed patterns of being and align ourselves with the vision of the enlightenment as identified or personified in the life of the Buddha. And ritual can be really helpful in the sense that it can really help us to pursue this path of development. It can become a mirror that shows up our own limited views and really opens up the felt sense of stepping up or growing up towards the ideal through ritual engagement. Of course, every story has a downside, and the potential difficulty of this particular perspective is that it runs the risk of seeing the world as something that we are stepping back from, stepping out of, because the world is often depicted in the development model as being surrounded or bound by delusion and ignorance, which we're trying to transform. So on the developmental model, we run the risk of seeing the wonder and the beauty of the world as just ephemeral and transitory. And so our interwoven connections with life can become rather devalued, even lost in this myth of growth. It suggests that the Buddha is somewhere over there in the transcendent, the unconditioned, above and beyond this messiness of being human. But that's one aspect, maybe a downside of it. But of course, there's a much more positive side of this myth, which is that it calls out energy and inspiration out of us. So we really take responsibility for our actions and our mental states, and we let go of this fantasy of being a victim to our life, and instead we engage with it creatively. We align ourselves as closely as possible to the precepts and really consciously develop ongoing positive mental states so that we can eventually become the Buddha. So moving on to the second myth, the second story, which is the Buddha becomes me. So in this sense is surrendering to the influence of the Buddha, allowing the Buddha to enter my life through a sense of surrender to those beneficent influences. So this can be a real relief if we've been pushing really hard on the developmental end of practice. It can be a real revelation to change modes to this more receptive, this surrender end of practice. So we can simply relax, become less effortful, and really open our hearts to the Buddhas. And through this practice of surrender, we really open to wonder and mystery. There's a sense of us coming into relationship with a far greater sense of our own small mind with its preferences and its views. And we actively, through surrender, we can really choose to serve the suffering world by receiving the blessings of the Buddha so that they manifest within our own lives and pass through us for the service of others, for the welfare of others. So there's always a downside to these stories, these narratives. And in terms of this the narrative, the story of surrender, the disadvantage of this is that we can become rather fatalistic or passive within our practice. We can fall into the trap of understanding the Buddhas are actual beings rather than simply processes and beneficial energies which we can receive, draw on. So we can, this surrender narrative can tend to turn the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas into actual beings. So we can really, we need to be careful around this area. And one of the clearest ways of avoiding this literalism around seeing the Buddha as something distinct and outside of oneself, outside, well, as kind of actually being, is that we can contemplate the kind of inherently empty and transitory nature of what we describe as our own self, our own being. So we are just process, just as the Buddhas are just process. So the next one is that this sense of discovery. So this is a more internal perspective or internal view of our relationship with the Buddha. In this one, in this story, we actually imagine that Buddha nature is actually inherently within us. And the practice of the path of discovery is to actively attempt to dissolve what we describe as these obscuring veils. So this is the kind of the volitions, the habits that we carry in our life that create this construct of a solid sense of one's identity, one's personality. And these can be seen to be veiling, obscuring this inherent Buddha nature, which is within us all the time. So there is, as always, a downside to the path of discovery, the path of the story that we already have Buddha nature within us, is that The downside is that this may give us be quite subjective about our experience. It's all to do with me, but also it can really underplay the vital nature or relationship we need to have with ethics. So we may come to become deluded in that we imagine that everything we do, everything is an expression of Buddha nature, so we can do what we want. Of course, this is a completely false view. And the other problem with this, the Buddha nature narrative, is that we may become less curious about other people and the world, because really this practice can become quite self-referential. And briefly and lastly, the emergence model. So this is the storyline for this is a sense of immanence. So the discovery path suggests that Buddha nature is already here, but simply obscured, whereas this emergent model is more suggesting that Buddha nature is always here, but only in potential in every moment. So there's slightly different flavor to the emergence model. But they similarly have, I think, discovery and emergence, we can see they're quite closely connected in many ways. So just to end this little section, I should just say that in some ways, we need all of these models, all of these stories. They're all vital for the spiritual life. And it can be really helpful to recognize the particular story that we are more drawn to, or we feel more that is the nature of our practice. And perhaps look at whether we need to, or whether it might be helpful to draw out these other aspects of practice. What we can be sure of is that all of these are vital for our spiritual life, but they'll tend to have relevance at different times, different phases of our practice. I think the main thing always to remember with these is that they are methods. They're always methods of deepening into our relationship with freedom. They're not trying to define or analyze any metaphysical truths. I think probably the last thing to say about this is probably the crucial thing really, is that by working with any of these models, any of these stories, what we're trying to do is give rise to insight. The kind of the path of the Dharma is to begin to really see how things are and align ourselves with reality rather than our delusions. So insight actually dissolves any of these models, any of these stories, because ultimately we have to let go of every story, every narrative, in order to enter the direct experience of vision that leads to liberation. So I'm aware that's quite a lump to absorb, but I thought it was just in terms of this sense of working with our stories, recognizing our stories. It may be helpful to, in the sense of any area of spiritual practice, but I think it can be particularly true within how we approach ritual. each of these different modes, these different stories, will affect the way we approach ritual. So it can be really helpful to consider these different modes when approaching ritual. So I'm going to jump modes now, and to do that I thought it might help us to have a different image. So just recognizing the relief of leaving all that cerebral information to bring us down into the natural world. So here's a poem by Mary Oliver. You do not have to be good. You don't have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. And meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. And another poem from Rumi this time. Be helpless, dumbfounded, unable to say yes or no. Then a stretcher will come from grace to gather you up. We are too dull-eyed to see that beauty. If we say we can, we're lying. If we say no, we can't see it, that no will behead us and shut tight our windows onto spirit. So let us rather not be sure of anything besides ourselves, and only that, so miraculous beings come running to help, crazed, lying in a zero circle, mute. We shall be saying finally, with tremendous eloquence, lead us. When we have totally surrendered to that beauty, we shall become a mighty kindness. So the reason I'm referring to story and myth is that Buddhist rituals, they are enacted stories that can really help us weave new meanings out of our bare threads of our experience. They can really help us comb out the knots within the fabric of our being and align this warp and weft of our imagined selfhood with our path to freedom. So I want to emphasize that within this upcoming course, we won't be trying to explain away the mystery of ritual or tell you what story you should be acting out. It's more that we want to create the conditions for your own deepening personal inquiry regards what brings you to life. So for myself, I've been reflecting on my own relation to ritual, and I have to say it's brought me into these places of utter dark blankness. I've opened up to places in myself that have simply cloaked me in sleep, places where I just go unconscious. But I've also felt my senses edging into a new territory of clarity, but then only to find that meaning, those emerging answers to what is ritual, turn to dust. So I've been circling in confusion and ambivalence regarding the significance or the ultimate meaning of ritual. And I'm just left with more questions. Now, having said all that, I recognise that might not be a great advert for this course I'm trying to promote. But what I can say right now is that I've come to some peace in staying with this uncertainty, these questions, because I want to invite you onto a course where you'll have the opportunity to reflect on your own relationship to ritual without anyone telling you what it should look like, or what particular shape or quality of relationship you should have to ritual. So it might be helpful just to open up an observation which was made by Subhuti about the 4 myths that I've just described. He suggests that every myth, so in this context every ritual, has a front and a back to it. So I think it's a really interesting concept. So the front is that which opens up into dialogue, which reveals the living meaning towards any enactment. And the back is the spiritual dead end that the ritual will lead us towards if we interpret the shape and the words and the actions too literally or too exclusively. So what this means, if we have expectations and preconceptions about what we should experience within a ritual, we are limiting, even killing these rituals so that they can't speak for themselves. A ritual needs to be able to live and open to reveal its meaning to us in the moment. And Subhuti talks about this front and back as being actually inseparable, like 2 edges of a coin, 2 sides of a coin. So the emergent meaning has its own pace and form along our desires to fix things into patterns of pre-existing understanding. And there's always going to be some sort of dynamic relationship within any spiritual practice, any aspect of ritual. But we could definitely say that these active and receptive aspects are definitely present within ritual. And I suspect that we can't really benefit from the front face of our favorite mantra, our favorite ritual, without a degree of having some back face to it, this degree of a pre-existing understanding to be able to make meaning out of what is emerging from the ritual. And I think this might be really helpful in terms of seeing any area of spiritual practice in this light. So the more we hoard up information and Dharma knowledge, we run the risk of thinking that we can somehow control and define what experience is going to arise and how we're going to respond and relate to them. And we may easily forget that the Dharma's always there only as a finger pointing. And the path is always one of engaging with curiosity and kindness regarding the moon of direct experience. So if we go too far down this path of equating understanding with experience, we run this risk of getting trapped in literalism around any practice. But having said that, of course, it's equally important and helpful to have the framework of the Dharma as we engage with what is alive and emerging in our life. And we could, in a way, see this as form and emptiness in action. So I've just said a little bit so far about these four myths and this idea of the front and back of practice. So there's been a few questions that have been coming up for me in the last few weeks, which I thought I'll just go into very briefly. So the questions are, can I trust this sense of presence, this sense of something meaningful being right here between us, amongst us in this world? Can I trust my experience, my body knowing of what seems to be in this area of what we might call the mystical or the sacred? And can I trust that this mystery isn't concealed or hidden by a world, thereby creating some false duality between the world and something beyond the world? Can I see that the world, that mystery and the world are integral to each other? That the mystical doesn't transcend the world, but completely saturates it? And can I really trust that liberation, whatever that may be, happens right here, not in some other place, not in some heavenly fantasy of escape, but right here in this life? And from these questions, for myself, I recognize this sense of the world being rooted in the sacred and not being something that obscures or veils the sacred. And it's the sacred that leads me towards ritual. And I see this felt sense of connection with my surroundings is an essential thread that serves this quest for meaning. If I could constantly weave this cloth of the sacred into my being, it would strengthen this capacity for reverence, which I mentioned last week. And would also counter these apparently toxic threads of doubt, distrust, cynicism, and pride within my armored body, my enclosed heart and mind. And for some reason, I think this is something of this front and back. I feel they both need to be honoured, or at least be in awareness. To sense the sacred and the bleak cynicism feels to me like the back and the front of ritual. It feels as if they're somehow, sorry to jump about with my metaphors, they feel like some Dharma door into non-duality. It feels important to stay with the cynicism and the sense of the sacred and bring them in relation to each other. And for myself, this seems to be part of the nature of ritual. So I'm just going to return briefly now to finish, just to go back to the poems which I read earlier. And the phrase that I want to return to is this phrase of surrendering to beauty in order to become a mighty kindness. And to me, this is what epitomizes my understanding so far of ritual. And I really love that the Buddha never told us what to think or how to act. But there was always this invitation for us to test the Dharma in our own experience, test the ways of the wise. And I recognize that Buddhist rituals are really one of the most direct ways that we can emotionally test the path of the Dharma, because rituals can be seen as enactments of honoring and evoking reverence through surrendering to the beauty and the meaning directly in front of us in every moment, always arising, always renewing. And this surrendering to beauty in order to become a mighty kindness doesn't take away the pain and the madness of our inner and outer worlds, but it does seem to lead to a direct knowing that the only answer to my own madness and the madness of the world is to meet it with this mighty kindness. If I've got anywhere in these reflections over the last few weeks, I do recognize that Buddhist ritual, just like any other aspect of the Dharma, is always underpinned by love. So just to end, it's probably obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway. Ritual is nothing just as an abstract idea. Its life and its meaning will only become visible by being enacted. It's a clear and definite action to invoke a heart response. Now, this potential for evoking, causing our heart to respond is an incredibly powerful technology, because it's our heart that actually defines the course of our life. It's the heart that is harnessed by this technology to harness the body's intuitive knowing and embodied responsiveness. So rituals are developed to be active enactments of images or journeys from one place of being to another that create conditions for us to receive the meaning directly by weaving it within our body's knowing and opening the eyes of our heart. And I and Tim and Jay and Alison invite you to join us on this journey of discovery into the realm of ritual. I'll leave it there.